So we've been talking about how states interact within the international system. And an important part of that, particularly for realists, is this idea of balance of power. When we talk about balance of power, we're talking about a set of rules that political scientists and historians have sort of distilled from looking at the behavior of states over the centuries, and particularly the behavior of great powers, or the very powerful states that tend to be able to operate regionally or even globally. So the first of these rules is that states are working to increase power. Again, this is a realist theory, so that shouldn't be a surprise. States want more territory, they want more resources, they want to improve their position in the world. Second rule, states will fight rather than lose power. And so if you think that potentially you're going to lose territory, or you're going to lose access to important waterways, or lose a potential ally or client state, that might be grounds to launch a war, to fight to protect your state's position in the international system. But war doesn't mean, a war to the death and total destruction of an adversary. Balance of power tends to suggest that states should stop fighting before a powerful state is destroyed. And I think for a lot of Americans who maybe grew up with the model of World War I or World War II as sort of the ideals of what warfare looks like, this seems a little bit confusing, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about the next two pieces in the balance of power system, right? And so you want to be able to oppose any coalition or state that might become dominant. Right? And so if you perceive that there's another state out there that's gaining power, that's gaining position in the international system, and in 5, 10, 15, 20 years might be in a position to do you real harm, you want to seek out allies that you can link up with and can potentially balance, this is where balance of power gets its name, balance that other state that's out there that could potentially do you harm. And that means that you need potential coalition partners. And so I could give you an example of sort of 19th century geopolitics in Europe, where you have a situation where France and Russia are sort of long-term enemies, right? During the Napoleonic Wars, France invades Russia, is thrown back. Russia leads a coalition to defeat Napoleon. A few years later, in the 1850s, you have a push for Russia into the Crimea region, and France opposes Russia's sort of expanding position, and there's again sort of a regional war between the two countries. But by about 1880, 1890, France is looking at a very different strategic situation, and looking at a situation where Germany, which had been fractured and divided, is now unifying and powerful. And France realizes that if it's going to have a chance to survive against a Germany that's on its border, it's going to need friends. And so it actually reaches out to Russia, its mortal enemy of the last 80, 90 years, and they form an alliance against Germany, because both France and Russia are looking at that situation and realizing that they now need each other. Right? And so one of the critical observations of balance of power theory is that if you're going to be able to check other states, you need to make sure that there are other states out there that you can work with, and that you need to have potential partners. And a state that is your adversary today may very well be your critical ally in some balance of power situation in the future. So wiping states off the map is not necessarily a good outcome for balance of power. Particularly because what happens when you start limiting the number of states in the international system is it becomes difficult to find coalitions that balance out properly, right? In an ideal scenario, you have two sort of loose alliances that are looking at each other, and neither feels like the other one could destroy it, and so they're more or less in equilibrium or stable. But if you don't have enough states, you can run into problems with that, where you have one alliance coalition that's stronger than the other alliance coalition. So the final rule of balance of power is that you want to maintain flexibility. You want to bring in additional states or territories, find other ways to balance that system. And so one of the things that we see in the lead up to World War I is that as Germany is unified, as Italy has unified, the number of powerful actors in the European system is shrinking. In order to maintain some sort of balance, they start bringing in Japan, which fights in World War I. They start bringing in the United States, which gets involved in that European balance of power. And so you're bringing in outside states to try to figure out how to get the system into alignment. Okay, so one of the critical drivers of balance of power is that you perceive a threat from out there and you look for ways to check that threat. And so there are a couple of different ways that you can respond to that. And so balance of power theorists and realists in particular will talk about the relative merits of internal balancing, which is to build up your own state's military capacity, right? Whether that means throwing more dollars in terms of a percent of GDP into your military, whether it means developing a new weapon system, some mechanism to put yourself in a better position to meet a threat that's external and handling that internally, right? Internal balancing. Your other option is external balancing, which is where you find allies, states you can work with that can partner with you, and together collectively you can put up a resistance to a potentially powerful threat. If neither of those options are really available, if you look at the situation, you realize there's nothing you can do in terms of investing in your military to put yourself in a position where you might be able to check an adversary. If there are no allies that can work with you, you may want to consider bandwagoning, which is to simply align with or capitulate to the big, powerful state that's threatening you. And we've seen this work successfully over the years, and I can give you two examples. One would be the relationship between Canada and the United States. And over the years, Canada has recognized very overtly that there's no scenario in which Canada has security without a good relationship with the United States. And so maintaining that partnership and that friendship and that relationship with the United States has been a critical foreign policy goal for Canadian leaders, because given the geopolitical realities of where Canada is located, where the United States is located, and who potentially Canada could work with, there's really no alternative to challenge the United States. A second example would be Finland, right? During the Cold War, there was lots of talk about Finlandization and how Finland had essentially given up or had been ceded to the Soviet Union. It was part of sort of the Soviet empire in Eastern Europe. But if you look at the history of how Finland played that dynamic, during World War II, when Nazi Germany was on the march, Finland essentially aligned itself with Nazi Germany and said, we can work with you, we'll partner with you, you don't have to invade us the way that you did Norway, we will be friendly to you. And please help us against the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is threatening us. When Nazi Germany is defeated, Finland turns to the Soviet Union and says, okay, you don't need to invade us. You don't need to continue a war. Sorry about that whole alliance with Nazi Germany. It wasn't personal. We will work with you. And Finland essentially cedes its foreign policy to the Soviet Union, but is allowed to continue to exist as a democratic state. And they actually outlast the Soviet Union and emerge from the Cold War, having preserved the independence of their government, having preserved democracy, and doing that by saying, rather than challenge a potential threat on our border, we're just going to accept that that's the world we live in, and we have to work with that. And so bandwagoning is a strategy when these other options are just simply not viable. Okay, so when trying to think about a threat and who states are going to balance against, and we're trying to predict what those patterns are going to look like, realists have identified four sort of drivers of that sense of threat, about who you need to check, who you need to work against. And the first and foremost concern for states is proximity. A big, powerful state that sits on your border is much more of a potential threat than a big, powerful state that's far away across oceans, that doesn't share a territorial border with you. So proximity matters a lot. We pay a lot of attention to what's happening very close to us. What's happening further away is far less of a concern. Second is aggregate power. Earlier on, we talked about measuring power, and I showed a map that reflected sort of if you had to fight World War II again, if you had to mobilize your entire industrial base and engage in conscription of your population, what are the resources you can mobilize, right? And that would be aggregate power, right? If you had to throw everything down that you had to fight a knockdown, drag-out war, what could you bring to the table? And that's certainly something that states look at. So we might look at GDP, we might look at population and say, these are important things. And states that are wealthy, states that have large GDPs, states that have large populations can potentially harm other states if they put their mind to it. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily have. So aggregate power is certainly something we look at. Offensive military capabilities is maybe something that maybe raises greater alarm bells in the short term, right? That's looking at the number of tanks and guns and bombs you have, the number of soldiers you have currently in uniform, how effectively trained they are you able to deploy those forces and actually conduct military operations? States that have large militaries, even if they don't have large aggregate power, are going to appear more threatening and more dangerous than states that maybe have larger aggregate power but haven't really invested in their military. And again, if we're thinking short term, who's a threat? States with strong offensive military capabilities are going to be states that rise to the level of attention. And then finally, offensive intent, right? Regardless of aggregate power or offensive military capabilities, or even proximity. If you have a state that's saying things like, I am going to invade you, or your territory should be mine, that's going to raise alarm bells and sort of trigger a counter mobilization, external balancing, internal balancing, compared to a state that says, look, yes, I have military resources, but we can be friends. I have no ill intentions toward you. We can work together and cooperate in peace and harmony. The stated intent of a state is going to have a huge impact in terms of how threatening they are perceived by their potential rivals. So realists tend to think about things like military power and offensive intent, but other theories will emphasize other elements in terms of thinking about balance. And so it might be ideology. One story about the Cold War is that you have this division between capitalism and communism, authoritarianism and democracy, and that maybe that's driving the tension and animosity in the Cold War. Another story you could tell is about culture, and maybe cultural differences spark fear or dread or misunderstanding, and that we can explain alliance behavior using culture. One of the projects that we're going to be doing for this week is to actually test that hypothesis, looking at clash of civilizations and to see if that actually helps explain how alliance patterns form. Similarly, we're going to test this idea that democracies, regime type, is a proxy for threat perception, and whether or not we can explain alliance behavior based on, are you of a similar regime type? We'll look at that question as well.